Hold on.
Oh. Okay, thank you. Ready? Okay, welcome everybody to our new friends and visitors to the group, and those that have been with us all the way through for the your previous rich and provoking engagement with your presenting, questioning or participating in your own way. Thank you. So just to go through some housekeeping for today, we are recording, so please do adjust your camera and name to suit your preference. The presentation seminar series from Child and Society, seminar series I should say, it's offering a safe environment for us to share, to dialogue and to open up questions and philosophical answers, and of course networking opportunities towards future creations. So today we aim to present for 40 minutes with time at the end to engage with concepts, difficult dialogues. So please do engage with the chat throughout, sharing reflections or provocations. And if you've got any questions, please do let's put that onto the chat and then we'll engage with you at the end. So I have pleasure in introducing today's childhood and seminar series, which is the strand of difficult dialogues. So the paper to be presented today explores the tantrum, and we look at how it teaches us about research, pedagogy and child activism when lines of inquiry are followed from the tantrum as encountered in early childhood context and through children's literature. The seminar will explore how we might find generative possibilities through difficult dialogues with toddler tantruming. So I would like to hand over to our presenters today, Professor Jane Osgood and Professor Victoria De Ruycker from Middlesex University. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Angela. I'll just share my screen. So we have a PowerPoint we'd like to share with you. Is that going to work? It's not working, is it? Let's try again. Why does it do this? I think it's as more people join, something odd happens.
Maybe us participants can turn our cameras off. It might give you a bit more energy while you're presenting, if that helps.
If you close the presentation and open it again, it might work.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So can I, a little bit about difficult dialogues while Jane and the presentation are coming up for us. Just to think about the difficult dialogue today, is there anything today that's provoked about tantruming that is an area that you haven't thought about, or you have, or you felt comfortable with or uncomfortable with? Maybe we can open up some spaces to talk about Jane and Victoria's presentation today in a way that you hadn't thought before. Thinking about children as agents when they're tantruming, thinking about adults and their reaction. And I know I was provoked thinking about the language of tantruming when I was reading Jane and Victoria's paper.
Victoria, are you able to try and share it? It's not working from my end. I know that means we don't get my edit, but I think that's fine.
I think I don't have your absolute most recent one, Jane.
That's fine. It was only a tiny tinker.
Okay.
Just while waiting for the presentation to come up, I think it's interesting as well thinking about children and their cork last week, and today we're thinking of tantrums, so how their actions provoke us adults to be thinking more about what they're doing and their interests. Okay.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks for that.
Is this working?
Yes, it's working. Okay,
Okay.
thanks for that, and thanks for filling in the gap, Angela. Technology is wonderful when it works and a complete pain when it doesn't. But anyway, we're up and running, and we really wanted to share the presentation, the PowerPoint with you, because it has images from Angry Arthur. So without it, you know, it's just us speaking, and actually it's about the power of the literature and how that shapes our engagements and theorizations and conceptualizations of the tantrum. So we've written this piece entitled "That's Enough," but it wasn't, and that's a direct quote from Angry Arthur. And what we're really looking at is the generative possibilities of attuning to what else a tantrum can do. And what we bring into play a range of theoretical concepts, and we're not only thinking about child agency from a humanist or anthropocentric position, we're drawing on a range of traditions. So just to kind of set the scene, what is the tantrum? Often it's used in the plural, and typically it denotes an uncontrolled outburst of anger and frustration, typically in the young child. So in the paper, we attempt to enact a feminist project of reclaiming and reconfiguring the toddler tantrum. And as I say, we draw on a range of theoretical traditions to do this, to investigate the complex yet generative possibilities inherent within the tantrum, to argue that it can be encountered as more than human, as a worldly becoming, and as a form of resistance to anthropocentrism and childism. So we propose that the tantrum might be reappraised as a generative form of child activism. So rather than something pernicious and problematic and difficult and in need of regulation, it might actually be a form of political activism. So stay with us as we try to unfold this line of argument. So we do this by mobilizing the potential of arts-based approaches to the study of childhood to reach other opened out and speculative accounts of what tantruming is, what it makes possible, and what it might offer to stretch ideas about and practices with very young children. So we undertake a tentacular engagement with children's literature. So not a literal analysis of what does this mean, but rather what does it do and what do we do with the affective forces that are set in motion from the children's literature and our engagement with it. So we're bringing together a concern with affect, materialities and bodies as they coalesce in more than human relationalities that are captured within the tantrum. And so in doing so, the unthinkable, the unbearable, and the uncomfortable, and ultimately the unknowable are set in motion in the hope of arriving at a more critically affirmative account of childhood in all its messy complexity. Over to you, Victoria.
Yeah. So childhood states are commonly invoked by adult humans in derisory ways. You know, don't behave like a child, insults, put downs. In this case, we've gone through a period, haven't we, where statesmen have been likened to unruly, unreasonable, petulant toddlers. And it's a strategy frequently employed in the popular media. While infantile and clownish ways of behaving are often met with disdain, the authors in the special issue that we wrote for actually argue that these ways of being could instead be seen in terms of their productive potential. Drawing on post-human and feminist theories, it then became possible to explore toddler in other ways that challenge a history of childism that constructs the child as less than adult, proposing instead that the figure of child as inherently developmental and progressive is inexorably linked with how we conceive the category of human. So collectively, the papers in the special issue work to reframe the less than child, the not yet human subject, as a figure of potential through animistic becomings with the world that spill beyond the bounded individual and self or other binaries. So a range of decolonizing strategies are put to work to undo bounded and linear constructions of early childhood.
So the paper that we're drawing on in this presentation today is included in a recently published special issue of Global Studies of Childhood. And the special issue takes toddlerdom seriously as a political move to reclaim certain ways of being in the world and to directly engage with the precarities of life in the Anthropocene. So this is where you see the difficult dialogues and the eco-pedagogies that this seminar series is interested in pursuing and tracing the entanglements come together. So we consider the implications of globalization and capitalist logic for contemporary childhoods by generating alternative accounts that variously recognize the agentic capacities of the child and childhood as presenting vital opportunities from which adults and communities can learn about political renewal and hope when confronted with the challenge of finding ways of living and dying on a damaged planet, to borrow from Anna Zing. So it's by making toddlers central to the project that we engaged in seriously playful encounters with critical post-humanist theories that work to disrupt ways in which the world is viewed, sensed, encounters, and how it might ultimately be reimagined. And there's a double move that takes place. We are simultaneously centering the toddler child in our investigations and our explorations, whilst also decentering the human subject and bringing into the fray the non-human, more than human, the political, the environmental, and so on. So with the Tantrum, children's literature, cinematic portrayals of giant babies, improvisational theatre, the universe quake, and the gendered naughty chair, we take up Haraway's invitation to move from the terrors of the Anthropocene, the devastating consequences of the Capitalocene, to the more generative possibilities available within what Haraway terms the Cthulhucene, as a space, place, and time in which toddler offers a key to explore how revolution might be rethought and carried into action. This is where we're gesturing towards the tantrum, the toddler tantrum as a form of activism. So as a phenomenon that is materially discursively produced, toddler does important work to both sediment, aerate, and disrupt ways of knowing. By reclaiming the spectacle of the toddler, we create questions about the time we are living in, the time children experience, and the world our children are inheriting, the world they experience, and the worlds that they and we make together. So Claire Colebrook stresses one effect of the Anthropocene has been a new form of difference. It now makes sense to talk of humans as such, both because of the damage we cause and because of the myopia that allowed us to think of the world as so much matter. Humans are now different, and whatever the injustices and differences of history and colonization, we are now united in being threatened with non-existence. So, of course, the reference here to we and us in inverted commas denotes that differences and power asymmetries continue to shape humanity, with children persistently on the margins, but most likely to face the heaviest costs and burdens of human-induced destruction and extractivism of the Anthropocene epoch, which is then further intensified by axes of difference in the form of social class, poverty, able-bodiedness, race, and gender. So then it's entirely correct that young children and youth activism in particular should rage with the intensity that it does. Young voices shaking with rage is precisely the form of activism that's needed to demand accountability and action of those white statesmen who are claimed behaving like the unruly and petulant toddler. So yes, this demand for accountability and action from another faction of the we of the human species, the privileged, rich, white, cis hetero men, from whom the long history of Earth's destruction can be traced back. And here we're thinking with Rosie Braidotti. So as global temperatures rise perilously and the reality of fires, floods, and plagues unfurl, it's impossible to ignore the impassioned frustrations and intensities of the hot rage of Generation Alpha. Next slide, please. So in this paper, we have this as a backdrop. We trace it through Angry Arthur, the children's literature, which Victoria will go on to deal with in greater depth. But really what we're doing is seeking to take up Stuart's affect theory and concerns with atmospheric forces and how that works to shift the tantrum from a child human state to something more confederate, more worldly, and more contagious. So as Kathleen Stewart says here, an atmosphere is not an inert context, but a force field in which people find themselves. It's not an effect of other forces, but a lived affect. And that's how we're taking up our conceptualization of the tantrum, something that's felt and produces other affects and generates other ways to be in the world. Okay. So for us, it seems one of the things that struck us when we were writing the paper together is how infrequently, if ever, we as childhood experts and people connected to children in various ways and shapes and forms as parents, aunties and so on, we've never actually witnessed a real life tantrum. So the mythology that kind of surrounds the tantrum is bigger than the reality of the tantrum. And we see this as something of a pernicious mythology that frames tantrum in particular ways, in ways that position the child in as feral, wild, uncontainable or irrational. And therefore, because of this out of controlness, that there's a justification for containing and controlling those wild, out of control bodies. And so there's this kind of drive for strategies and remedies that the adult must put into play to diffuse and extinguish the tantrum. So in many senses, the tantrums have been socially and historically constructed as both inherently bad and bewildering. And the other thing that struck us as feminist scholars is this childism is also something we see waged against women, hysterical women having a hissy fit, you know, are subjected to the same sort of social construction of being out of control and wild and in need of remedy and restraint. This is me again. Okay, so in late capitalism, we see this anthropocentric neoliberal preoccupation with the bounded human subject as a source of gross profiteering. So the tantrum has been subject of multiple industries. So in the background to this slide, it's now been diagnosed as a medical condition. And as such, there are a whole raft of medicines, pharmaceutical companies profiting from the containment and controlment and remedy of the tantrum. There are also a whole raft of alternative therapies on the market that, you know, caring parents will want to ensure that the tantrum never becomes a reality in their life and that they'll have to deal with. So there are these alternative therapies, and also behavior strategies and games and interventions that you can bring into your home or into your early childhood context to diffuse or distract or extinguish the tantrum. But it's all about it banishing it and it being this unreasonable and unacceptable thing. And the other thing that we've noticed, and I'm sure many of you have too, is this incredible industry of these self-help books for parents particularly, and Jo Frost, the super nanny, is perhaps the most infamous for, and with it the naughty chair and the naughty step, and sort of shaming toddlers into reflecting on their bad behavior and finding strategies and ways to regulate the tantrum out of a young child body. So in the paper, we dwell upon the work that the simmer down chair, or as they're referred to here, the naughty chair, do in the regulation of angry child bodies. So this is an apparatus that I don't think it's universally found in every home with a toddler or every early years setting, but it certainly exists, and it's certainly considered to be a fairly effective strategy at containing and extinguishing the tantrum. But what struck us as particularly troubling was the gendering. So tantrums become coded as gendered, and they are that. So the girl tantrum is very different in complexion to the boy tantrum, but both can be banished through the regulation and use of apparatus like the naughty chair. And essentially, and the timer on the is quite interesting, this regulation of body by time and apparatus and materiality. And but what we were wondering as writing this paper was, why is so much investment made into trying to tame the toddler and to eradicate rage and frustration? So then we started to play with this idea of what this apparatus does and what the material discursive force field that circulates around the tantrum, what that might do, what that might feel like from a child body perspective. And this this poem came about as part of curating our paper. Who starts, Victoria?
I can't see the top.
What does a tantrum do?
Thank you. When a child,
When biologically,
thank you, can't see the top.
Yeah,
read
sorry.
until, can you read down to becomes angry and then I'll join in?
Yeah. What does a tantrum do when biologically a body becomes angry?
Muscles tense.
Neurotransmitter chemicals
Catecholamines.
released.
A burst of energy.
Angry desire.
Immediate protective.
Action.
Heart rate.
Accelerates.
Blood pressure.
Rises.
Breathing.
Quickens.
Blood flow.
To limbs.
Preparation.
For physical action.
A young face.
Flushes crimson.
Attention narrows.
Locked.
On the target.
Of anger.
Impossible.
To focus.
On anything else.
Quickly.
Neurotransmitters, hormones.
Adrenaline, noradrenaline.
Are released.
Triggers.
Readiness.
To fight.
So we found Angry Arthur incredibly useful in assisting us to take seriously both toddler and tantrum, taking a sort of closer interrogation of where toddler rage can take us. Arthur's rage is like many, it has many literary allusions, and it's rather like what Anja Heise von der Lippe termed the post-human Gothic, which is a constantly shifting interrelational entanglement with ungovernable feeling, like that of Frankenstein's monster, who suffers a kind of post-human anguish which turns to rage at the moment it becomes self-aware. Unable to form friendship with a child that it ends up killing, and feeling trapped in the limits of its existence, the monster lashes out for total destruction of the subject in a scale of monumental, apocalyptic rage. Like Arthur's, this is the existential rage of primal rejection of its creator stroke controller and the mobilizing wrath of the subject. In Mary Shelley's case, her speculative fiction conducted an early feminist thought experiment into post-human cyborg rage against Dr. Frankenstein's thoughtless science, or what Haraway would call the God trick. For Hywen Oram and Satoshi Kitamura, who put this book together, the speculation is the catastrophic extent of child rage, raging against the adult, raging against bedtime, conceptualized as literally earth-shattering. So by engaging with child tantrum, as it's storied and illustrated in the picture book, we've traced connections and hauntings to consider childhood innocence and taboo topics, to excavate how childism gets produced how it circulates, and how it gets fixed in place. Attuning to the intensities, the affective forces, and subversive narratives within this picture book allows for an exploration of the uncomfortable characteristics of the Anthropocene: power, misogyny, greed, war, violence, terror, human exceptionalism, human-induced environmental destruction. Whilst Hywyn Oram's text repeats this calming refrain, "That's enough," from various members of Arthur's family, the line also always ends with the repeated warning, "But it wasn't." Kitamura's double page, and several double pages in fact, depict Arthur's sense of self-shattering into multiple repetitions, which is called streaking in animation, or synchronistic replications. It very much draws, of course, from the language of film and animation, which again children are very strongly attuned to in their own understandings, and what's called motion blur. And obviously, as we look through this, it's clearly metaphoric for the state of affect, and at the same time for a planetary condition. If we look at two early images of the effect of Arthur's rage, you can see it smashes up, cuts through, bends, fragments, totally spins out the world and all that is in it. First, it's toys and furniture that are unbalanced and topple, then trees, buildings, streets, land is entirely washed away. As Kitamura depicts it, Arthur's anger has no limit. His temper is not that of heat, but like anger itself, stirs things up, first into a storm cloud, exploding thunder and lightning and hailstones. For Karen Barad, lightning mucks with origins. Lightning is a lively play of indeterminacy, troubling matters of self and other, past and future, life and death. It electrifies our imaginations and our bodies. Back to Frankenstein's monster again, of course, and how that monster was given life itself through the conduction of electricity and lightning. Arthur's temper is certainly an electrifying matter, a hurricane, hurling rooftops and chimneys and church spires. Then a typhoon, tipping whole towns into the seas. An earth tremor, and finally a universe quake, until everything is an agency of things. Nothing more than bits in space, as the text reads. So the arts have helped us reframe questions, the questions that Jane began with, of how we understand toddler and how it can be understood as a becoming, a phenomenon materially, discursively produced, and does important work to sediment, aerate, and disrupt ways of knowing, certainly in the best picture books, the best literature and arts for children. And in our piece, we try to elevate the idea of toddler through careful exploration of what a toddler is and what it does. And in a sense, the field of childhood that many of you listeners no doubt know about and come from have long recognized the validity of toddler and the legacy in studies and explorations that disrupt the conventional readings of that term. So our deep commitment to toddler is felt in the ways in which we care about and for and with, the ways in which we attune to toddler in all its generative complexity. Oh, I want to go back to that a minute, Jane, before you finish. Just to say that increasingly, perhaps especially in work that Jane and I do together, it's the arts that are helping us reframe questions. It's using our arts methods. And for me, children's literature that disrupts notions of controlling toddler behavior, like Angry Arthur, is of course highly sophisticated critique, both in and out of the game, if you like. So it may be addressed to a child listener, but there's no question that work like this is operating at highly sophisticated both child and adult level, watching and wondering at the idea of child tantrum and its associations with global climate crisis. Arthur, like Walt Whitman's poem, sings the body electric, expressing and even celebrating an energy and agency beyond our wildest dreams.
So just to conclude, although, you know, the happily ever after question mark, we're kind of constantly caught in the middle, and that's what post-humanist theorizing offers us. But what we're trying to get at in this paper, in a very messy, meandering way, is that there's this need to take affective ecologies seriously, and then that opens up these other ways of thinking, encountering and making connections to seemingly unrelated. But once you start to do that work, it becomes very obvious that a tantruming toddler body is not separate from the Anthropocene and climate destruction and so on. So we urge that attuning to the generative possibilities of what else a tantrum can do is important political work. It offers a window into ways in which adult human might reappraise and encounter our place in the world with fresh optics and sensitivities, and following Haraway responsibilities. So I think that's kind of, now we've arrived at the point where we'd like to welcome reflections, thoughts, comments, questions.
Jane and Victoria, thank you so much. I'm just going to share with you the chat. There was some comments on there. But first of all, just before we go to any questions and reflections, just to share and talk about some of the provocations that's coming out when we think about the difficult dialogues aspect, where we are listening as adults and we're reacting to children's tantrums and thinking about what children are actually expressing and doing and sharing and how they're being, and how us adults actually respond is quite interesting, as is the environment that they're in. And the word dissatisfaction comes in about a tantrum from an adult maybe perspective, which is something from difficult dialogues we might look at later. But Johan, I know you had some thoughts and to share on the chat. I don't know if you wanted to come in at this point to comment or to reflect further.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks very much. I think this was a really fascinating paper. I'm looking forward to reading the article, and also just beautifully presented with all the literary stuff around it. Really great. Literature also has that sort of role of a tantrum, I guess, sometimes in the life of adults. So I think that was very nice. My thought, the comment that I put in the chat was really around, I was actually talking about this with my wife last week. She wrote an article about Melanie Klein, and we talked about it also in terms of the project that I'm doing around children and trees. So this thing that I've been working on a lot is this notion of the wild child, or what happens when the wild in a child is subdued. And we put this in the context of this discussion of Melanie Klein around the good breast and the bad breast, and saying, well, actually that puts the child in a position of passive receptivity, that this infant is sort of is not really capable, and has to learn to deal with sometimes the feeding breast is there, sometimes it's not, and this whole frustration. And the thought around this was that to then say that actually there is a potency in the child right from the start, and it seems that children have to almost subdue this potency in order to survive rearing. And that's where this attitude of the innocent child comes from, the childism. But actually it is about the positive, life-affirming, creative, activist dimensions of natural aggression in a way. that we don't want to see in children, or that we don't want for some we don't because maybe we cannot deal with that intensity, and how important it is that this wildness is somehow they will find maybe a different way of dealing with this wildness. And so when you were speaking, I thought of this, and I thought, oh, this seems to me to be somehow connected to this seems to me to somehow be kind of parallel between what we were thinking about and what you're trying to do in the paper. So I don't know, that was just a kind of thought, but maybe you could say something about this notion of wildness, or if that plays a role in your thinking, which seems to me also to be connected with the notion of the post-human or the more than human.
Okay, Jane, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about wildness, although I do have a book you need to see, Joanne, which is a picture book called Wild Child. It's amazing.
Oh, really? Okay. Oh,
yeah,
wonderful.
Really beautiful. Yeah, really would be useful to you, I think. I think we enter into Klein a little bit, don't we, in the paper, Jane? And this is the difficulty with a presentation where we've got to cut sections, but in a sense, there's my background is psychoanalytic originally, and so analysing literature using the work of Klein and of Winnicott after Klein, or in debate with Klein. I mean, what you've written here is absolutely bang on. One of the very special contributions I think Klein made was the idea of the baby in rage. So the idea that a baby that we acknowledge, or she acknowledged, that absolutely tiny babies, have the right to rage and express it, and that is what they're doing. It's not some kind of absolutely primal unknown. It is rage, and it relates to the process that you're exploring there, I think, very strongly. But Klein's very special because for me, the depressive position, obviously, to analyze that in great detail, we don't have time for, but it links very strongly to what we do with aggression, and how Klein struggled very much with that, having established for herself, I think, a theoretical position that was a little bit of a cul-de-sac, that she couldn't then take herself out of. For me, Winnicott finds a very beautiful little gate out of that cul-de-sac through creativity, through this idea that there is the good enough, the not good breast, bad breast, but there is the good enough. And that effect and affect on the child is a calming factor, but it's also one in which the child can regulate their ecstasies and their depression. They can regulate their rage, that creativity is actually a form of, the life force, as Winnicott saw it, of the reality principle, as he saw it. So his work, that I stay very, very much wedded to, it works very well in conjunction to working with literature, as I do, and with creativity and arts methods, because Winnicott's position on it, as you might have already read, if you look at his object relations theory, he's essentially looking at how very small children relate to toys, to scribbles, to what they make, to their play and their creative urges. And he's seeing that as the absolute in-between of the reality principle, however nasty that might be, and the pleasure principle, or the play and creativity principle. So that in-between, this very nuanced area of in-between that he worked in throughout his life, is, I think, really strongly the same kind of in-between that so much post-humanist studies is also exploring.
Yeah.
Can I jump in? Yeah, I think what we're trying to do in the paper is to think about, try to resist the temptation, which is so hard, which is to think about the toddler and the tantrum as something that resides in a human body. And of course, in our poem, we're trying to get at what happens in a biological and chemical and, kind of in those kind of very real senses. But then what does all of that rage do? It's not contained within the bounded human body. And it actually takes the simmer down chair, the naughty chair. So it's the assemblage of all of those component parts and their relationalities that produce the tantrum and then produce toddler in particular ways. So I think, you know, to think about agency, we need to think about agency in Berardian terms of, or in post-human terms. It's not anything that resides in an individual human subject. It gets produced through these encounters and entanglements and relationalities. And if we can start to think of childhood and child and toddler in those ways, then it actually frees up space to think more confederately, and also to then take what we can learn with and from encounters with the child to other places, rather than thinking about trying to know and understand and fix the bounded human child subject. Then the object of the exercise becomes much more political in the big political sense. And I think that frees young children of the burden of this kind of developmentalist logic of how, you know, that they're regulated and the expectations that they should be performing in particular ways. And the tantrum is a performance that's absolutely not tolerated. So there's, and I think in the comments, there was a question or a comment about, you know, particularly toddlers get frustrated because they don't have words. But they, last week I was at a conference and there were some fabulous presentations about the young child, the pre-literate, if you like, young child who doesn't have the words. But they express themselves in ways that if we are prepared to slow down and tune in, you know, there's so much there for us to take up and learn with and from. And this is Stuart's atmospheric forces and, you know, affective forces, and what all of that does, that requires we don't jump to immediate explanations and so because the explanation leads to the remedy, leads to the reinscribing of this thing as a problematic kind of child state, rather than a phenomenon that can be seen as both generative and troubling. Sorry, that was very rambling answer, but yeah, it's I think there's just so much potential here to kind of blow apart in an angry Arthur style what we think we know and how we routinely behave and react.
Yeah, I mean, Alison's right too in making a link to Where the World Things Are, to Sendak's absolutely game-changing book, you know, absolute game changer, that book, in so many different ways for children's literature and for picture books, and how they're designed, how they work through, if you like, in a Freudian sense, that affective state the child is in. And I you know, that wonderful line that you've included, Alison, you know, let the world rumpus begin. I think that word rumpus, children know instantly, like, sense what that word means, even if they've never come across it before. You know, it's just one of those beautiful words, isn't it, that was used so rarely in our general everyday speech. But when it emerges out of literature, okay, that's what rumpus is. As it's metaphorically, you know, produced through these enormous monsters. It's very, very effective book and links very nicely to what Jane was just talking about. Sorry, Nathan, you've had your hand up, haven't you?
Yeah, I'm not sure quite how I'm going to formulate this without it being too rambling either. But my question here is shorn of any knowledge of post-humanist kind of philosophy, but completely agree with the focus on the affective dimension and the relationality of emotions and affects along the lines of Ian Burkitt, Margaret Wetherill, and Sarah Ahmed, and so on and so forth. But I was wondering how you account for the seeming normative element of a book like Angry Arthur, which is about, it's about the relationality of anger and the tantrum and so on. But where he ends up is in a solipsistic universe where only he exists, in a denial of a relationality. And it seems to me part of the normative message of the book is that's a problem, because he gets left alone. So, you know, reading it through that kind of lens, the tantrum is a problem. Acting like that is a problem. So how do we account for that kind of normative aspect, the message, you know, that perhaps that end message, you know, in the last few pages, through the kind of framework you've been talking about?
So that's a really good, yeah, it's a really good question, but I don't, for me, I don't see him as, I don't see that ending as normative. You could, and absolutely I see that you could, because he's on his own, he's destroyed everything but his bed. But for me, that goes back to Klein
And his cat, he keeps his cat, doesn't he, as well? And
his cat, yeah, and that means, you know, that goes straight and directly to Winnicott, in fact, of like having a toy and destroying it in rage. And then Winnicott writes, you know, what that illustrates for children is toy, I love you, I have destroyed you, you have survived my destruction of you.
But I think one of the things that, so it's interesting, all of these kind of, oh, what about Sendak, what about here? And through the process of kind of coming to the literature that we wanted to work with, or that worked on us and through us in thinking about approaching the toddler tantrum, we rejected a few other children's literature books on the basis that they were remedial. It was, okay, so how can we, through this story, instill the narrative that tantruming is inherently bad and you shouldn't do it, and that blah, 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 and there'll be consequences, or you'll be nurtured out of it, or whatever. And the beauty with Angry Arthur is it's so destructive, and it covers, and it's such a wild adventure, much like Sendak's Wild Things, that it's just the processes that are presented throughout the narrative are so rich and so full of possibilities that actually the end point is not really the point, really. It was more about, you know, the what happens along the way, and also how, you know, these adults are on the periphery. The granny's sitting there in outer space knitting, saying, you know, that's enough, but it wasn't. And then the mother is banished, and, you know, it kind of repositions the child and the raging child in a completely different way to much other literature that is written with a different agenda and objective underneath. So I think that was what really sparked our kind of connection with it, in terms of the project we set ourselves in terms of reclaiming and reconfiguring, because it does some of that work for us, I think.
So it's in part seeing that ambiguity itself as generative, rather than some more, maybe some more literature that's a bit more hard on the nose with a normative message.
Yeah. Ruth had a comment about this kind of Ruth, do you want to speak to it, or shall I?
Yeah, no, it's hi Jane, and hi Victoria. Thank you so much for that. It's just superb discussing this, and I just think that this whole idea of agencies is something that is not included at all in early childhood training for early childhood professionals, in any kind of parenting self-help guidance that I've seen, or in any kind of social media. And yet, you know, that anybody who has been a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or what have you, I'm sure has witnessed when relationships come alongside each other and work together. Those agencies work through all sorts of different levels of effect to have very, very productive and generative outcomes. Not that there's a magic bullet or you know, I'm not trying to romanticize the situation of, you know, good parenting or anything like that. But I just feel quite strongly that actually, and certainly in my last sort of 30 years of training educators and artists and cultural managers, that the idea of agencies being shared and multiplicitous and generative all the time within the environments that we're interacting within is absolutely crucial. It's absolutely fundamental and foundational to understanding how to build relationships with more than human and human. And I just think if there was an awful lot more understanding of that and respect for agencies that are within and around children as well, that might go some way towards us understanding a little bit more about the generative possibilities of that wildness, that fire in the belly, that, you know, desire to express and to be vital in the world, which is so much a part of every baby, every toddler, and every child, as much as it is a part of every adult. But we learn how to regulate that, and that's kind of a shame in a way. I'd quite like to have a few more tantrums, I must admit.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, as adults, we're so disconnected because we've had this whole lifetime of that being it's eradicated from being a civilized human. It does not include the possibility of rage and out of controlness. Yeah, Megan, you have your hand up, and you also left a comment in the...
Yeah, it was just to sort of respond. So I have to apologize. I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. So I'm a midwife by background. So I don't know anything about early childhood studies or education. And so this has been really eye-opening for me. But I sort of, both as a fairly new mother, but as a midwife, thinking about some of the things that Ruth was saying, and actually, like, if we think about women in pregnancy, they're often infantilized and told to behave and told to, you know, and you're only a good patient or a good mother, and you lose your kind of adult identity and you become this, you know, child. And at no point, and then you're told, this child in you is told to behave, and your child needs to behave, and, you know, you need to be seen as a good mother and a good parent. And you touched on coming at it from a feminist angle, and, you know, I have really noticed, even as a midwife, I behaved myself in labor and I behaved myself postnatally, when actually I wanted to scream at everybody and tell them to get off me and all the rest of it. And so I think we set parents out very early with this idea that your child represents your parenting. And it was me that left the comment about my son not having words, but he's very communicative and he will tell us what he wants. And sometimes that involves a scream. And it's really interesting how people offer me advice as a mother, or what you want to do is da da da, but they tell my husband what a fantastic parent he is. And that, you know, that just, that one really gets me. Because, you know, the mother needs to be sort of taught how to teach her children to behave, but a dad managing a tantrum is doing a great job. And that obviously doesn't represent everybody's experience and everybody's thoughts, but just societally, I have to behave and get my child to behave to be seen as good, to be seen as productive. And sorry, that was really rambly, but that's just kind of the angle I'm coming at, is a bit more from the parental side, I guess.
No, I think all of that is absolutely fascinating, kind of connects to Ruth's point about re-educating adults. You know, we need to, I think we need to unlearn in order to relearn, and that involves this kind of process of attuning to young children and what can we learn with and from them, rather than, but it's a tall order to resist this kind of endless kind of regulation of ourselves as parents, as professionals working with children. You know, if you had every child having a rage, you know, you would be judged in particular ways as an early childhood teacher. You would be judged in particular ways as a parent. But, you know, how do we shift the landscape to say, actually, what's going on here? Just slow down, just tune in to the child. And, you know, like, and then when you start to think about the simmer down chair, how utterly ridiculous that is as an apparatus. I mean, how is it ever going to calm and soothe a child? You know, it's by its very design and intention, it will always have the reverse effect. So, you know, but if we were to think about, you know, what that means to our practice. So I have a PhD student of mine a little while ago, Anna Moxnes, writing in the Norwegian context, was thinking about the chair in early childhood and what it does and how we use it and how it regulates bodies and how it reinscribes policy and curriculum and so on. And so amongst her trainee early years teachers, she had them all tie each other to a chair so to simulate what it's like to be a child, being told it's lunchtime now or it's snack time now in your high chair, and then sitting them all around. And that kind of regulation and containment of your body according to a clock, according to you know, a schedule and an expectation, and learning a set of skills, is utterly preposterous from an adult perspective when you're kind of forced to do it at that moment. And that's, you know, quite powerful when you're thinking about how bodies are formed and shaped in spaces and through practices and apparatus and materialities. So yeah.
I think there's a close connection. If you look at Lord's comment in the chat about the neuroscience, that's an interesting one too, because if we look at the brain and all this new material that we're gathering about the brain and its function in different states, you know, you see something very close to play that happens in anger, in rage, and in outbursts, something close to the way that play is also being recorded and sort of analysed and examined. So playful behaviours are often highly risky, are often risk-taking deliberately to sort of see where your borders are, to see what limit you're capable of. And, you know, for many children, the playfulness of a tantrum is not evident to many adults, but you know, that there may be elements that we just haven't even considered, I think. And for me, again, back to Kitamura, to the most playful picture books, that they actually present as play, as playful, and that ironic and rather sort of teasing nature that they have. That's enough, but it wasn't. You know, just the way that language is used playfully, that is not a finite judgment made on the tantrum, but just allowing that opening out. That's enough, but it wasn't. Each time that window is opened again. And that's a really interesting sort of series of windows for me, that we continue to open those and think about, let's just open another window to that and reconsider it playfully.
Ruth just said, you know, in terms of the context, environments that could be offered for educators, for spaces, effective materials that might help a child's rage and safety, and this idea of curling up in a duvet with your son. And I remember exactly doing, you know, just getting all the soft pillows and saying, right, okay, just do what you need to do. That's fine. There's no shame in this. If you feel, you know, and then my kids are like, what, I'm allowed to? Oh, you know, so I think you're absolutely right. There's just so much more that we need to be doing and can be doing that we're not, frankly. Yeah.
I just thank you so much. I think the provocation, I'm going to go back to Victoria's point about the kind of how children engage with their emotions, and how sometimes a tantrum can be enjoyment, but us adults might not even notice that. And I know Helen Tovey from Roehampton University, she did a lot of work on dizzy play and the dizziness of turning things upside down and the concepts of throwing everything around, a bit like Bakhteen's point about carnivalesque. And sometimes the power that's kind of really within a tantrum is, you know, absolutely, the more we look, it's like a storm and an explosion, and what happens with the aftermath. So I think so much for us to really, we could have a whole another session on this amazing presentation from Victoria and Jane that explores tantrum from a completely different perspective. And I'm hoping that there'll be lots of feedback to you, Jane, Victoria, that maybe there'll be more discussions on available to this. We could have some space just to have a talk further about it. But thank you both so much for your presentation today, and thank you for all the participations, all the comments, all the on the chat, and for those who took part in discussion. Really, really appreciative. And I know next week we have another, sorry, not next week, in 2 weeks' time, we have another fantastic session, and my computer's just gone off, so I'm hoping it's on here. It's on the 6th of February with
with Federico. Maybe Abele, are you there? Are you able to say? You're on mute.
let me find it, sorry, just yes, it's on the 6th of February with Federico Farini, Northampton University, and Mari Istanes Fjeldstad, Norwegian Academy of Music. So Federico Farini will talk on the environment, resource, context of both, and Mari Istanes Fjeldstad on the title of her talk is Missing Stickers and Bouncing Bows, Material Agency in Music Education. Thanks. Hope to see you then.